Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was interviewed by Ta-Nehisi Coates at MLK Now, where she was asked, can a society that allows billionaires be a moral society? Watch.
Do you think it is moral for individuals to, for instance, do we live in a moral world that allows for billionaires? Is that a moral outcome in and of itself?
No, it's not. It's not. And it's not, and I think it's important to say that I don't think that necessarily means that all billionaires are immoral. It is not to say that someone like Bill Gates, for example, or Warren Buffett are immoral people. I do not believe that. But I believe
that he kicks his dog.
Right,
like
that. I'm not saying that. But I do think a system that allows billionaires to exist when there are parts of Alabama where people are still getting ringworm because they don't have access to public health is wrong. And I think it's wrong that I think that it's wrong that a vast majority of the country does not make a living wage. I think it's wrong that you can work 100 hours and not feed your kids. I think it's wrong that that corporations like Walmart and Amazon can get paid. They can get paid for by the government, essentially experience a wealth transfer from the public for paying people less than a minimum wage. And it not only doesn't make economic sense, but it doesn't make moral sense, and it doesn't make societal sense.
So I think this is, on one hand, fantastic. On the other hand, I think it's obvious. But unfortunately, we live in a world where this isn't yet obvious. So hearing this from a sitting congressperson, I think, is important and powerful. So the idea that living in a society that allows billionaires to exist, essentially meaning living in a society that allows that sort of wealth to amass to an individual, is an immoral society. I think this should be obvious to anyone. The idea that we can live in a society where there are billionaires, I mean, I don't think people truly understand how much money $1 billion is. Nobody needs $1 billion. Nobody. But there are multiple billionaires. There are many billionaires. At the same time, there are people dying from starvation. At the same time, there are people working over 40 hours a week and don't have a place to live. Or can't afford a place to live, or can't afford food. So this idea that you can have all this wealth amassed by a few individuals and they keep that money at the same time that there are millions of people that are dying because they don't have the resources they need to live. No, that is clearly not a moral society. So how anybody can even debate her on this point blows my mind, because it is so obvious that this is not a moral society. Now, she also says there, I mean, it's important to point out because people want to get so, fucking caught in the stupid details. Of course, it doesn't mean that a billionaire in itself or that person is immoral. They're simply, they amass their wealth in a system that is immoral. The system that allowed them to get that amount of money, that is immoral. It doesn't mean that, as she says, it doesn't mean that Bill Gates is an immoral person. It doesn't mean that he's a sociopath, even though in many cases, a lot of billionaires are sociopaths, because you sort of have to be one to be able to get that kind of money, to be able to bring yourself to a point where you're making that amount of money. You kind of have to separate in your mind empathy with money. But that said, it doesn't mean that billionaires themselves are inherently immoral. It means the system itself that allows them to amass that sort of wealth is immoral. So I get bothered when people don't see this, because to me this is so obvious. And the other point that she hits on here, like corporations like Walmart or Amazon, they get huge tax breaks. They get your taxpayer money to build their headquarters. Amazon is getting taxpayer money, over $1 billion, to build their headquarters, even though Amazon is an incredibly profitable company and doesn't need anybody's money. But even though they don't need anybody's money, they are still taking taxpayer money as a way for them to build their headquarters in New York. Even though, again, they didn't need that tax break. They didn't need that money. But because Amazon is such a powerful company, they used that power and that wealth to essentially scam all these other cities into giving them a better deal. And then they chose the better deal, even though they likely would have wanted to choose New York anyways. So this is just, that was just their way of being able to take your money and build their headquarters, even though they never needed it to begin with. And at the same time they're doing that, they're not paying their employees, or they weren't paying their employees proper wages until Bernie Sanders introduced the Stop Bezos Act that then forced or essentially shamed Jeff Bezos into finally raising their wages to $15 an hour. But again, even that, especially in a city like New York, is definitely not enough money to live. So I don't want to keep harping on the same points, but it bothers me how a lot of times this discussion is brought up. So even on issues like Medicare for All, oftentimes people like AOC will be asked, well, how can you possibly afford Medicare for All? What the question should be is, how can you not afford to give people health care? Are you saying, let's say Jake Tapper asked the question, are you saying, Jake Tapper, that we should deny people health care because they happen to be born into a poor family? That because you're poor, you don't deserve health care? Is that what you're saying? But the questions are never framed that way. They're always framed from this capitalist perspective of, oh, how can we afford to give people healthcare? As if it's like some gift. Healthcare should be a human right. You need healthcare to live. So I, as a Canadian, understand this. But a lot of Americans, because you're born into the system that is so fucking corrupt, you're not able to see outside of it and understand that you deserve healthcare, that everyone deserves healthcare. So a lot of it is about the framing. When you frame the questions from a certain perspective, before the person even answers the question, you are communicating to an audience what the quote-unquote normal position is. Oh, it's normal to think that it's too expensive to give everyone health care. Just by Jake Tapper or Chris Cuomo or anybody else asking a question about how can we afford universal health care, you're making people think that it's okay to not give people health care, when that is not okay. Now, this, so essentially what AOC is doing here, not just in this video, but in general, is she's reintroducing morality back into politics. And that extends to an issue like climate change as well.
Millennials and people and, Gen Z and all these folks that come after us are looking up, and we're like, the world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change. And your biggest issue is your biggest issue is how are we going to pay for it? And like, this is the war. This is our World War II. And I think for younger people, we're looking at this and we're like, how are we saying let's take it easy when 3,000 Americans died last year? How are we saying let's take it easy when the nth person has just died from our cruel and unjust criminal justice system? How are we saying take it easy when the America that we're living in today is so dystopian, with people sleeping in their cars so that they can work a second job without health care, and we're told to settle down? It's a fundamental separation between that fierce urgency of now, the why we can't wait that King spoke of, that at some point these chronic realities do reach a breaking point. And I think for our generation, it's reached that. And I wish I didn't have to be, doing every post, but sometimes I just feel like people aren't being held accountable. And until we all start pitching in and holding people accountable, I'm just going to let them have it.
So that was great. Again, this is, it's almost disappointing how incredibly popular AOC is, because everything she's saying is everything that all of us should already be saying. It's what politicians should already be representing. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is popular because she actually has morals. She actually has empathy. She actually understands how rigged the system is. AOC should be what every politician is, but it shows you, her popularity shows you how broken, how rigged the system is. So, like, how she started there, when people are asked, how do you pay for it? How do you pay for to combat climate change? I mean, how do you pay for tax cuts for the wealthy and large corporations? How do you pay Amazon over $1 billion in New York City when you have crumbling transit and crumbling schools? I mean, this idea that, tax cuts for the rich, I mean, how do you pay for it? Who cares about that question? It doesn't matter. It's tax cuts. Tax cuts are perfectly okay. And handing over corporate welfare, handing over billions of dollars to already largely profitable corporations is perfectly okay. But healthcare or combating climate change, how do you pay for those things? It's so absurd that this is the conversation at all. All of what I'm saying right now should be obvious to everyone, but it isn't. And it blows my mind every time I see it represented. So AOC, thank God she exists. Thank God there is somebody on the national stage who's a congressperson who is putting a light on the fact that morals have been completely removed from politics. And thank God she's putting them back in.